Our first speaker today is a lead narrative designer from the Draw Distance company, uh, Krzysztof Zięba. And during his career, he worked on several really nice projects like Serial Cleaner and games based on the IP of Vampire Masquerade. And today he will share with us his experience of game development. So please welcome him.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for the introduction. I'll say up front that any questions that you guys might have we'll keep until after the presentation. I hope to get through it in around 45 to 50 minutes, so we'll definitely have some time for questions, and I'll rely on Valerie to let me know if you guys have any. The title of the presentation is Hard Facts and Soft Skills, 10 Lessons for Novice Game Devs. I was kind of tempted to call it 10 lessons for 10 years because I've been in game development this year. I've had my decade in game development gone by, but there's some of those lessons came much later than at the very beginning of my career. So hopefully we'll get into a bit of that as we progress through the presentation. Like was already mentioned, my name is Krzysztof Zięba, Chris for short. I've been a game designer and writer since 2011. That's how I got my start, with a little bit of experience in game testing as well. Over the years, I've done many different things. I've been a tester, a proofreader, a key account manager, whatever that means, basically the contact person for a company's email. I've been a seminar leader. I've been a mentor to some of my younger colleagues who started out in writing or wanted to get a start in game dev in general. I've translated stuff. I've been booth staff at SN, at certain other industry specific conferences, that kind of thing. And probably I'm missing something. I'm missing something here. There's probably been more different things that I did. I started at Artifex Mundi in 2011, and I've moved to iPhone for All in 2016, and since we've gone through a name change, and we are now known as Draw Distance. At Draw Distance, we've cooperated with companies such as Curve Digital, with Microsoft, with Paradox Interactive, which is our latest cooperation that you guys might have heard about, with Vampire the Masquerade. And I've also privately worked with Robot Gentleman, Awesome Games Studio, Moonlit Games, and other smaller companies that I've done some additional work for. This talk is going to be mostly about my path through this kind of career and the experiences that I had in the meantime. So, like you might have seen in the description of the presentation, it's going to be mostly useful to people who are just starting out or want to start in game dev. But hopefully, if there are any veterans watching, there will be some things here that at least resonate with you or are at least interesting. Before we start properly, I wanted to put up front a few things about who I'm not and what this talk will not be, connected to what I just said. So first off, I'm not an experienced AAA dev. I've only ever worked in smaller indie companies. At the moment, Draw Distance is about 50 people strong, and that's the biggest team I've ever worked with. I'm not an artist, by which I mean I don't do art in terms of graphic art, and I'm also don't really consider myself an artist in terms of the craft that I do, of writing and game design, and we'll get to that later. I'm not a programmer, so I'm completely hopeless when it comes to programming. I tried picking up bits and pieces of it over the years, but it never stuck. And I'm not a technically minded person in general. So even though I did a lot of work with, say, level design over the years, I always kind of struggled with working in engine and doing things properly. And that's something I'm going to touch on later on as well. I'm definitely not the data guy, and I'm not a money guy. I'm definitely firmly on this creative side of things, where I just like to work and not really worry about whether my work is something that is going to be marketable. I do take that into account, obviously, like every designer should, but it's not my primary objective when I create games. It's mostly to make the best game possible. But hopefully, even though I don't have any of that experience, I'm still somebody whose experiences can prove a useful perspective on having a career in game development and how that can pan out. In this talk, I will not provide you with a set of universal tips for being a better a better designer, a better writer, a better tester, whoever it is that your career is focused on right now, whatever job your career is focused on right now. But hopefully, some of those tips are going to resonate with you. But they're not a perfect solution to everything. I did a little bit of research, but there's not a lot of it. There's not a whole lot of data-proven scientific things in this talk, but I will provide you with a few sources that are at least anecdotally seem proven. It's probably, like I said, not very useful. The talk itself won't probably be very useful to game dev veterans, but hopefully you will get something out of it anyway. And at the very least, I do hope that this talk gives you a set of helpful lenses through which to view your place in game development. In other words, your mileage may vary, but hopefully everything that I say is going to, or at least some of what I say is going to be interesting to you in some way. So the first lesson, or the first question really, is why are you here? By which I mean, why are you doing what you're doing? Why are you in game dev? Why are you working in video games? And there's many valid answers to this. Some of you might be here because it pays well. Some of you might be here because you like that games are interdisciplinary and you just kind of like the experience. I'm like that, definitely. I do appreciate that there are many different perspectives that mix in game development, and I find that very exciting. You might find the medium itself exciting, especially if you come from a background in more traditional media. Perhaps the interactivity of games is something that you find really enticing, or you just love games and want to make them, which is something that a lot of people start off with. That's definitely how I started my career in game development. There might be other reasons, like you being seemingly good at it, basically feeling that you found your place because you did it for a while and it seems like you know what you're doing. And obviously, you also might have a great idea that you want to see made, especially if you're a designer or a writer. There might be this game idea or this story idea that's in your head, and you really want to put it out there and make a video game out of it. But what I wanted to say up front with this first point is that whatever your reason for coming here, that can change with time. And with experience, you will find that this kind of interest, this kind of passion has its ebbs and its flows. You might find that at some point when you wake up in the morning, you're not very excited to go to work, but you kind of have this approach that is apparently what you kind of do now. That it's just something that you've kind of fallen into. You seem to be good at it, yes, but mostly it's just something that you've been doing for so long that it's hard to understand, hard to fathom what else you could be doing. You might be addicted to the process. There's certainly a bit of a exciting aspect to the way that most video games are made, in which you have those like short sprints of like really intense work, and then that release at the end of a milestone when you made something that you're proud of, and basically that's can be a little bit addicting. Working with interesting people is definitely one of the reasons, especially if you've worked as a single company for a long time. You will see that there are some social aspects to the work as well. You will form friendships that can last you years, even even beyond the current job you have. But sometimes you just might not be very sure about why it is that you're still doing this. And some of my observations in this talk are going to address how how I felt over the years at certain parts and how I kind of got through it, with a few helpful changes in perspective that I think that that currently make me have a much healthier relationship with my work that I used to have. The point here is you need to check in with yourself often, uh, and you need to know the answers to these questions, not or just know that you don't have an answer at a specific point in time. But what I want to underline is that you have nothing to prove to anybody. It's your life, it's your job, and you're here to do to basically to be the best version of you in this position, and not to not to impress somebody else. And to that point, my second advice would be to play to your strengths. And by that, I mean that you've likely came into game dev, or you'd likely want to start working in game dev because you have some kind of taste or a talent or a knack for something. You might have like really good taste in story, and that's why you're interested in becoming a writer. You might have a talent in game design that you've had since being a kid, and maybe that's something that you want to expand upon in video games. Or you might have a knack for something entirely different, like a good eye for detail or a good eye for art. And whatever it is, I would urge you to make use of it and to make it your primary strength. Because that's the thing that you're passionate about. That's the thing that brought you into here in the first place. And obviously, again, that can change over time. But I would argue that you should seek out opportunities to utilize your specific set of skills, or even your knowledge and interests that might have little to nothing to do with the actual work you're doing. So, for example, if you're good at writing jokes, or you're generally considered a person with a sense of humor, even if you're not a writer, you might offer some of your jokes or some of your ideas as character quips for the writers team. If you're a good organizer, even if you're not a producer at your current job, you might be very useful as a kind of intermediary between production and whatever it is that your team is doing. If you're no matter if you're a programmer, an artist, a designer, a writer, whoever you are, if you have a knack for organizing stuff, then you can help production organize around your specific specialization. If you have a broad taste in music or an eclectic taste in art, all of those things can be very useful, especially in some kind of early pre-production stage when we're still, bouncing off ideas of each other, or even later on if we're looking for something very specific, like for a sound of a club in a video game, or for a specific piece of art that we could adapt from the real world and put into the game, so that it says something about the story. Your knowledge here can be very useful, even if you generally have nothing to do with that specific line of work in your day-to-day work. I think that it's very useful to go beyond your job title and your description. So whatever it is that you're good at doing, you should try to do that, even if that's not entirely your job description. And you should definitely try to inject your interests into your work, because especially as a writer or as a designer, all of those inspirations are a very rich resource that we should definitely tap into. And there is nothing wrong about smuggling in some of your interests, especially if you feel passionate about it, because that passion is going to be evident in the end product. In other words, I would seek opportunities to be useful, but of course, this comes with a caveat. You shouldn't work more than you think is healthy for you. So in all of this, some of you might see here advice that you should basically like try to have your fingers in every pie, try to be everywhere at once, and try to help everyone at once. And obviously, that's untenable. That's not something you can do. And we'll get to that in a few slides. But in general, I would suggest that people seek out opportunities to be useful, with that caveat in mind. Of course, if you're working towards your strengths, you might have to stay aware of your flaws. Everybody has those. if you identify your biases, shortcomings, or any communication problems you might have early, that's going to be easier for you to manage later down the line. And it's very important to have a close look at yourself and to listen to what other people say about working with you, so that you identify those flaws, because often it's very difficult to identify them by yourself. But if somebody keeps saying that you have certain problem, if many people seem to have that same observation about how you work, or you hear the same request to change something in the way that you communicate over and over again, that might mean you have one of those problems. You might have some trouble focusing. Maybe you are the kind of person who jumps from task to task and cannot really focus on a single thing for a longer period of time. Maybe you have some difficulty in taking negative feedback. I'm definitely like that, but now that I know that I am, I can take precautions to make it to at least know that if somebody criticizes something that I do, I know that I'm going to curl up for a while. And knowing that I'm going to do this first lets me be like that a bit short, for a bit shorter amount of time. I used to have days sulking after somebody criticized something, but now it's just hours. I go back to my flat, I decompress, and the next day I'm ready to talk about those criticisms, or even during the same discussion or during the same meeting, I can now manage the fact that I know that I'm going to be critical of somebody else's idea if it was critical of mine first. And maybe you're really chaotic in writing, which might be important for you if you're a communicator or a producer or a writer, or a designer. Whatever that problem is, you should check yourself for progress on those often. You should see how you can improve. You don't necessarily need to keep doing things that you know you're not good at. So in terms of what I said before about, say, my experience with level design and with working in engine, for like implementing things in engine, I know I'm not great at it, so I try not to do it if I don't have to. And it's not really, I don't see it as avoiding responsibility. I see it as playing to my strengths, and knowing that I will not do a great job doing it, especially if there's somebody else who can do the same thing and do it better than me. There's no reason why I should be doing it. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't train and get better. So obviously, like, even though I kind of avoid doing this sort of stuff, when I do it, when I have to jump into, say, implementing one of our vampire games, or fixing some bugs, I try to do the best job that I can. It's not that it's not an excuse that I'm not great at it, therefore I don't need to do my best. It's more of a case like when I can choose my tasks, I tend to choose the ones that I know I'm going to be efficient and good at. But at the end of the day, we are a part of a team. So you're better off sharing your workload with others anyway, if you have that option. Again, if you come from a smaller indie team, that might be difficult. If you come from a bigger team that has like a very rigid structure, company structure, that might also be a bit challenging. But I would urge you to, at the very least, try to micromanage your tasks in such a way that you always do your best work, and perhaps use that line of thinking with your management, if you can do that kind of thing. This one might sting a bit, so if any of you feel a little bit offended, I apologize, but I think this is an important point to make. You're probably not as great as you think, but I do stress that that's okay. And why that's okay, I'll get into in a slide, I think, in the next slide. But what I mean by this is that if you walk around um, feeling like you're great at what you do, you can often let your ego get the better of you, and that's a problem. It's a communication problem, and it's a problem for yourself. Um, if you want to stand out, um, acting like you're infallible will make you stand out, but not in the positive way that you'd like. It will alienate people, because people will not trust you to come to you with their ideas, with their initiatives. If you end up in a position when you're considered to be the one person that everybody has to go to get something done, you're going to burn yourself out because that's a lot of work. And you're not going to be doing a lot of your own work because, managing a team of people when everybody has questions for you is difficult and eats up a lot of time. So you'll end up doing a lot of overtime. You'll end up being frustrated and tired. Instead, what I would suggest is not trying to have this air of authority around you if you don't have that authority yet. Authority is not something you have, it's something that you have to build over time. So I would say we should put a rest to fake it till you make it as an approach when in our kind of more artistic, say, specialities. And instead, I would argue you should make it so you don't need to fake it. So the proof is in the pudding. You need to do the work that you need to do. And if you're consistent at it, if you're consistently good at the work you provide, if you're consistently open to discussing your work with other people, and they understand your process, that's how they can gain trust towards you, and that's how they might point to you when there's something to be done in a specific area. There's another caveat to this, and that in that you might start out, especially if you're starting out in the industry and you haven't had a lot of experience, but you have this feeling that you have this talent that we've talked about in the second point. But there are some obstacles uh, before you that like make it impossible for you to reach your full potential. The obstacle is you. And it's not just a character thing, it's not just an ego thing, it's just how things are. You need to be doing the kind of work that you need to do for a long enough time to gain more experience and understand better how to do better. So on this, and yeah, it's a difficult and frustrating process is one of the points here, and it takes a lot of time. So one of the few things that I wanted to link to here, and you can take time to Google them now and obviously watch them later, preferably, but have them in your tabs for later reference. If you don't know about the Dunning-Kruger effect, you should definitely read about it, because that's basically an observation which points to the fact that the less knowledge about a specialty you have, the more mastery you think you have. And then later on, as you gain mastery, you realize that that you don't really have the amount of knowledge that you thought you did. With more specialization, with doing things for a longer time, comes more doubts, and that's also like a swing problem that can influence the way you work, but it's something you should be aware about. That's something that happens to pretty much every creative and not just creative people. And then the other thing you could search for on YouTube is Ira Glass the Gap. That's going to be a short, about 2.5, 3 minute video of dynamic typography, which shows the quote by Ira Glass, who's a writer, on how he went through a very frustrating period in his life when he realized that he wasn't doing his best work, that he knew he was that he could do better, but he didn't really know how to do it. And I found that video some years ago, and it was very hopeful to me, because it really succinctly summarized the problem that I had, that I felt I have, and I still have. I'm still not at my full capacity, and I'm probably might never actually reach the full capacity of my talent, but that's okay. It's a work in progress. You definitely don't need to be an author. So what I mean by that is there's this, especially when you're younger and when you start out, you might start out with an approach that makes you want to be like the directors in Hollywood, right? Or like the big names in video games like Ken Levine or Sid Meier from way back when, or Hideo Kojima, or whoever else. I would urge you to get rid of that, get rid of that ideal, to get rid of that goal. And here's why. If you're one of us, if you're one of the idea people, where our work is important, but the truth is we are kind of a dime a dozen. There's a lot of us, and because there's a lot of us, it's, I think, realistic to say that you're probably not special, but that's a good thing. When I say probably, I mean there might be somebody in the audience right now, or you might know somebody who is like a super talented person and they did all the right things in their career and they are on their way to become, a game dev rock star. And that's fine if that's the kind of lifestyle that you want. But I would argue that for the vast majority of us, that's actually a pretty toxic ambition to have, because the video game industry is not like the movie industry, and really even the movie industry isn't quite like we like to think about it. For every director that's seen as a visionary, for any Denis Villeneuve, for every Paul Thomas Anderson, for every Ridley Scott, there are many, many, many other people who are involved in that process, so the movie gets made, and they rarely get mentioned. And B, there are many directors who are not like those guys, and there are mostly guys. But there are directors who still do very good work, but they're just not those superstars, and that's fine. Because again, if you're anything like me, you're not in this for fame or for stardom. You're in this because you love the medium and you want to work in the medium, and that's perfectly doable, even if you're not a household name. The trap here is that it's not so much as an ambition as it's an impossible standard, and you're going to end up feeling very frustrated because again, you're not as great as you think you are, and the Dunning-Kruger effect and the thing that Ira Glass said. And really, you don't need to have all the answers all the time. Even if you are at a leading position, at a creative lead position in your company, and you are expected to have all the answers all the time, that can be, as any of you who were in that situation before, very tiring. That can be very exhausting, because you're just human and you will not have all the answers out of the bag. If a project lasts for, say, 2 years, the third month of production, you won't even know the questions that you need to have the answers to. That's a process. If you're getting into game development to be the next whoever, I think you should be prepared to be disappointed and a little bit angry. And the problem is that because you have this if you have this outlook that you're special but others are not, that anger might be targeted at other people, who don't recognize your talent, who don't recognize that you have great ideas, who don't recognize, etc., etc. And that breeds a toxic relationship. And I've definitely started out that way in Artifex Mundi, when I did alienate many people with that approach. And it was only later on, a few years afterwards, that I realized that this approach was just not very constructive. Instead, I would urge you to, again, identify your strengths, identify your flaws, and then be the best version of you and see where that leads you. And it might not lead you exactly where you think you want to go, but there's a little bit of excitement to that as well, to seeing your path unravel before you instead of having a pre-planned plan and then failing to meet that plan after life interferes, right? One thing that I've noticed that might be very useful to everybody who's starting out is that you should probably, or actually somebody who's not as so much starting out, as you've already worked a little bit, you already have some experience, but you seem to struggle with certain things. I would think you should raise the floor before you raise the bar. And by that, I mean that if you're a specialist in something, being a specialist in the long run is pretty great. But coming back to my level design example, to my in-engine example, bug hunting, bug fixing, etc., you should be competent at everything you do. So even if you're a specialist at something very narrow, if you're a designer, you should still know a little bit about bits of design that you're not really a specialist in. If you're a writer, you should be able to competently write the kind of content that you're not really specialized in. It's not just making your highs higher, not just making the company happy that they have you on in a specific line of work, but also trying to make your lows higher too. It's very useful because you might find, especially in smaller teams, you might find that you're not doing a single thing all the time anyway, because the team is too small for that. And so working on those lows will make you be a more useful person to the team. I would argue that most companies will definitely benefit from having a jack of all trades on board, by which I mean not, if you can do, say, art and programming and writing and design, then good for you. I mean, that's a great place to be, generally speaking, and I'm kind of envious. But what I mean by a jack of all trades is a person who, within their specialty, within their type of job, so be it an artist, be it a designer, be it a writer, can do different things. So for an artist, this might mean that you're not just good at character art, but you're also good at background art. You're also good at architecture or whatever else. And obviously, you can be best at everything. But what I urge you to do is to try to raise that floor. And so for some writing examples, you might be very good at story, but you might not be that great at writing snappy dialogues. That's certainly something that I had to learn over time. You might do great lore dumps. So you might be the kind of person who writes a long history of a kingdom in a fantasy game, or a long backstory of a character that's very nice to read and has a lot of great points. But when it comes to documentation, you kind of don't switch modes, and your documentation ends up being very long and very drawn out, and without the ability to quickly find whatever you need. So whatever it is that you're strong at, that's great, but you also should try to be better at the things that you're not great at. Which is, I understand, a little bit of a dissonance with what I said here. But again, the point of staying aware of your flows and doing the work that you're good at instead of the work that you're not good at is not that you should avoid doing it at all costs. It's just that in the moment, if you have a choice of doing one task that needs doing and you're good at it, and the other task that needs doing and you're not so good at it, you should choose the first one, because somebody else is going to take the second one, unless there isn't anybody else to take that, in which case, well, raise the floor before you raise the bar, and your life might be a little bit easier. With design examples, again, like level design is something that I used to do a lot about 2016, 2017, but I've since really fell off the level design train almost entirely. And so if I were now to jump into designing a level, I would have to raise the floor for myself by doing a lot of research, by doing some additional work, so that the levels that I do just aren't trash, basically. And similarly, like, I'm specializing more and more in the narrative side of things. I'm still competent as a systems designer because I've worked in board games, for example. But in terms of accessibility, I'm not that great. So I know that whenever I get to design another thing in the future, I need to read up on accessibility. So I realize what kind of things I need to be doing so that more people can play my game, which is obviously a good goal to have. Then there's another thing, something to be said about flexibility. So that raising the floor thing also means that you are more competent in more things. And that's a good thing, because especially in indie development, especially when you work at a company that does many different things at a time, or does, say, has a more loose production schedule and can spend a lot of time in pre-production, for example. The truth is that you will rarely only ever do one thing all the time. Especially if you're a designer or a writer, there are so many different things that you could be useful in that it's very rare that you will just have, in an indie team at least, it's very rare that you will have just a single very narrow specialty that you will do. In AAA games, I understand this is a bit different than in bigger teams, where you could have, say, a 3D artist who only ever does street lamps, or another artist who's only a foliage artist. But in smaller companies, you definitely need to have a bit of that flexibility. And what I understand by flexibility is not just the willingness to do the work when it comes to you, but also um, expecting that this is something that will happen. So not being angry at people when you should be doing X because that's what it says in your job description, but you're doing Y. That's actually a good thing, as long as you're, compensated correctly. Then doing things outside of your job specification is again something that I would argue people should be doing anyway. Um, Organizing production is difficult and it might leave a lot of empty space. It's something that Roof Tomandel, who I'm going to reference right now, even though it's away at the bottom of this slide, called it ambiguity. Apologies. And her 2017 talk, Embracing Ambiguity, is great on that. So if you have a chance, you can watch it on the GDC Vault, and it's also available on YouTube as of last year, I think. It basically, Roof Tomandel basically states that whenever there are periods of time when you're not sure what you should be doing, you should get better at self-organizing and finding stuff that you know needs to be done. Not only so you're basically not bored and you don't need to watch YouTube or scroll through social media all day at work, but also because by doing things, by doing additional things that might not be on the agenda at a certain time, you will be helping out the team in the long run, and you might be helping out yourself as well because you're preparing for things that might need to be done anyway at some point in the future. There's always something you could be doing to further either the project or to work closer with the team and get to know the team better. So I would argue that flexibility is both a defense mechanism, as in I am unsure of what I'm doing, so I'm trying to get something done so I feel like we're doing progress, but also it's something that, especially in a small team, might be very useful so that you're open to doing anything that needs to be done, even if it's entirely outside of your specialty. I would argue you should have a life outside of games. Especially when you start out, it seems like a lot of people come into this if they love games because they want gaming to be the main thing that they're known for. Everybody knows on a private level that you love gaming. Everybody knows that you're the person to go to ask about games, etc. And it kind of becomes your identity. But tying your identity to your work or to games in general is precarious. It might be a problem. I found at least at a few times in my life that actually self-identifying as a gamer first and foremost uh, made me more frustrated with game dev than anything else. You should always have a backup hobby that lets you switch gears. And obviously, you should follow what makes you happy. So if it's games, if that's what you want to do, even though like you might have some other interests, but if games are still the main thing that you want to do in your free time, that's good, but it should preferably be disconnected from your day-to-day work, and that's very hard to do for us creatives because you come back home after a day in work, and you have a good idea and you want to note it down, and maybe you want to work on it right now because it seems like a really good idea and it's super exciting to get on that idea, or maybe it sparks a session of 2 or 3 hours browsing the net in search of reference photos or whatever it is. It's very hard for us to disconnect from our day at work, and I definitely had times when I had trouble sleeping, and I kind of came out of the bed with a notebook in hand and spent an hour jotting down ideas for something work related. So it happens, but preferably you should try and disconnect your interests from the kind of work that you do. So, for example, in video games, you might work in a specific genre of video games, and hopefully you have another genre that you also like playing, and that's your go-to when it comes to relaxation. Because otherwise, if you're a designer, for example, you will intuitively try to analyze whatever you're working with. If you're a writer, you're going to analyze the movies that you see and the books that you read. And it takes away from the fun first and foremost, but it also makes it more difficult to separate your work time from your leisure time, which is super important. And especially now during the pandemic, a lot of people found that it's very difficult um, to separate your workspace from your leisure space. For example, in the room I'm now in, this is the bedroom, and that's a huge problem because this computer I'm sitting at is already my leisure computer. But I do have a second one on the other side of the table that I switched to during the pandemic because at least I had a different perspective on the room. At least I wasn't using the same setup that I had for my leisure time as my work time. Um, when I did, before I switched, it was a problem. I felt many times that I couldn't separate the time spent in work from the time spent, resting after work. So I urge you to try, if you're able to, obviously, if you have the space, if you have the means, to try and split that space. And of course, if you do get days off, you should make good use of them. Uh, Preferably, don't look at your phone, don't look at Discord, don't look at the company email. It's a day devoted to you and your free time, to your family, to your friends, whatever it is, preferably not your work. And maybe this is a bit of a controversial statement, but there is no glory in crunch, in my opinion. So, whenever your day to day work interferes with your day to day life, because your work is not the entirety of your life, hopefully, that's a problem. Crunch should be minimized. It can happen from time to time, it does happen from time to time, whatever you do, but you should always have this recognition that this isn't something that's normal. You should, when it happens, the thought isn't, well, it happens. The thought should be, how can we make it so that it doesn't happen anymore? And that's a production thing that I probably don't have the time to get into right now. But in general, because as you will see, one of the motives of this talk is that some change needs to start from the bottom up. It's something that I think more people should oppose in general and should ask their higher ups for help in organizing production in such a way that crunch isn't necessary. Two last points. The first one of which is intuition is king. Intuition is probably the best tool in a creative's toolbox because it allows you to make decisions quickly, to follow your gut, and to get it right most of the time. This is why I've read here that you should take the fail faster approach, by which I mean you should always follow your intuition, but if possible, you should follow it in small chunks. You should divide your work into small chunks that can be tested separately to make sure that your intuition was right this time around. And in design, this might mean designing only like small chunks of the systems or prototyping quickly say, for a tabletop game. If you can prototype something in paper, then you probably should do that. If you're writing, this might mean creating quick, short descriptions of things that you want to have without getting into much details. Because the truth is that if you spend a lot of time creating a lot of documentation, people might not read that first and foremost, because game dev is notorious for not reading documentation created by writing and design. But in general, what you want to do is find out if that's a good idea as fast as you can. And if you find out it's not great, then you need to scrap it as fast as you can. And intuition is a skill. You need to train that skill. You should play more tabletop RPGs, definitely, because tabletop RPGs are a great hobby, first and foremost, but also because they train all of the useful stuff that I'm going to sum up in a minute. So it trains your skills with your social skills, your imagination, your community skills, your problem-solving skills. It trains a lot of different things, and it's entertaining while it does it. So that's a good thing. You should, if you're a writer, write short fiction, maybe based on prompts. What I do is I write drabbles. Those are those exactly 100 words short fiction pieces, and I write them by drawing cards from different tabletop games with characters on them, and then adding some words from games like, say, the Crypto or code names or whatever other word game. And with those prompts, I try to write simple stories, simple short scenes that use all of those prompts. And it's sometimes challenging, usually amusing, and I think very useful to train your intuition and to learn that there are really no bad answers to any questions that you're posed. Well, not no bad answers, but when you train your intuition enough, you will only ever get decent answers, which is again one of these situations, right? You need to raise your competency in that before you get really good at something. You can practice improv if that's your kind of thing. And again, you can design small chunks of games as often as you can to test your intuition and to see whether, as a designer, your intuition still gives you the right ideas. And remember that other people have intuition too, so you should trust those people to bring it to the table. It's not just your ideas, it's everybody else's ideas and their intuition, which is just as good as yours is, just maybe a little bit different in terms of what their area of expertise is. But one caveat for that, you shouldn't say trust me as a way to make people believe that you're doing the right thing, because trust is earned, and you should show that you have a good track record so others start saying that they trust you, not the other way around. If you start with saying, well, I've got great intuition, so you should just trust me on this, whatever it is I'm doing, is very hard to argue with. And it again seems like you're getting into that auteur mindset a little bit, especially if your initial reaction is you don't want to explain to people why you think your idea is good because you're afraid they won't get it. That's one of the problems that you definitely can have over time. And the solution to this is your intuition has to be good enough so that everybody gets it when you write something, and that takes a lot of skill and a lot of time and a lot of work to get to that point where you can communicate effectively, so that people understand what you're saying, and they can and you can be sure that they are rating your idea on its merits and not on the way that you communicated it. And for soft skills and communication in general, the talk is named Hard Facts and Soft Skills after all. If intuition is king, then humility is most definitely the queen. There are a lot of soft skills that will allow you to get to communicate better with your team. Communication, of course, as a general skill, there's open-mindedness. You should owe up to your mistakes. You should be thankful for the time that people spend helping you out. You should apologize when you do something wrong. You should check in with people if you can, if you're in that position, to check out if they're happy with what they're doing, especially if they're doing something that you've told them to do. You should be asking for help. You should be offering help, and you should be sincere, and you shouldn't be afraid to be vulnerable. Because again, if you're not being vulnerable, then maybe you're going into this infallible mode, or perhaps this auteur mode when your vulnerability can turn into aggression when you're not in the mood, on when you're being undercut by somebody's point. At the end of the day, what you should remember is that we're all in this together, and our goal is likely the same: to make great games. You should be the change you want to see, even if it seems like it's pointless at the beginning. You will find that you have more allies than you think you do when you start being more open in your communication. I realize we only have about 9 or so minutes left, so just a very quick summary here. There's one acknowledgement that I wanted to give through to all of these points, is that my experiences are not unique, but they are subjective. So obviously I have my own background that's pretty privileged. I come from Europe. I have fluent English skills. I was fortunate to be raised in a family that did not want for anything for a long time. So I don't know what your struggles are, and I don't assume I have all the answers or even the best answers to address whatever struggle you might have, where it's some kind of condition that makes you that makes it more difficult for you to do this work, or whether it's some kind of past experience that really hurt you. I'm not here to say you should put those aside. Those are very valid, but I might not have the answers you seek. The points I've laid out in this talk were epiphanies that I had over the years, and I can only hope that they can be useful in making your path in game dev easier than mine was. Mine wasn't that difficult, really, but I did have some lows that I wish I didn't have. And maybe if I listened closer to what people told me when I was starting out, and if I had all of these points laid out in front of me when I was starting out, perhaps I would be less unhappy at certain times. At the end of the day, we are all a work in progress. So you need to go through these 10 points that I've laid out by your own and figure out whether any of those resonate with you, and how would you see yourself applying those to your life and to your work. And so I thank you for your attention. And if we do still have a few minutes left, I will be very happy to take some questions if you have them.
Thank you, Chris, for your talk. It was very interesting and full of reflexia. I'm actually personally agree with you with all the points, and they are very close to me, especially with the last one about humility. I'm often tell about that. But there is one thing that I'm not agree totally. So that's the name of the talk. The name of the talk was 10 pieces of advice for novice game devs. And I'm not sure that that advice is for novice game devs, because when you're a novice, isn't it the best time to work hard, to know what is crunch, to learn what are your strict sides and weak sides, and so on? I mean that, how do you think, if you don't have that experience in your past, would you come to this?
I would say that there are certain things that definitely, like making mistakes is something that you generally are expected to do when you start out, right? Nobody comes into, especially at a junior position, nobody comes into work and is expected to have all the answers, because again, we are not natural born talents, generally speaking. But in terms of crunch, and in terms of some of those worse conditions or any kind of prolonged stress, any kind of worse spell of self-security or of insecurity, any depression kind of related stuff. I think that's a system problem, that's a systemic problem, and it's not necessarily something that people should go through. If it happens and gives you that experience that you need to later use, that's fine. But because it happens, you might build up this tolerance to it. And my point here is that we shouldn't be tolerant of it, really. It's not something that we should accept as just part of the job. We should try to change it as best as we can, even if it's a long process and it takes a long time and it's difficult. And one of the ways to do it is when new people come in and they don't know that this is the case, and they are, shocked and abhorred that this is the case, and they really want to do something about it, that they're revolted that something is happening that we, as people who have been doing this for a few years, have already gotten used to, and we think, yeah, okay, that's fine. Somebody else comes with a fresh look and they say, no, this is not fine, you should definitely do something about it. That's the fresh perspective that I hope a lot of people coming into this industry after the last decade, after we did start talking about crunch, about working conditions, about the cost of game development, not just in terms of monetary cost, but also in terms of psychological cost, and all of those big stories that have been going on for the last few years with abuse in big companies, etc. I do hope that people that come into the industry now with all that knowledge will not accept it as something that's normal, but will surmise that it's something that needs to be dealt with and needs to be fought. if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. I understand what you're talking about. Yeah, it really depends on exactly company, because
Yeah.
it depends on its processes and values, and how they manage to do that.
That's
So
very true.
yeah, but as I understand, to draw distance, you manage to keep that balance, and that's kind of good for you. I'm happy for
Yeah,
you.
for the most part. Obviously, every company has its ups and downs, and every company is a work in progress. And we are definitely trying to do our best in this regard. And definitely, like from my perspective, in the projects that I'm involved in, I try to make it so that everybody always has a feeling that we're working towards a goal that's achievable, and not one that will require us to spend a lot of time working extra hours, and to then so it's all then worth it because it's our game, etc. Like I understand that this is a perspective that you can have, but after 10 years doing this, personally, I think that setting smaller goals for yourself and achieving them 100% is a bit healthier than setting a goal that you will need to do 150% of work to achieve, personally.
Got it. We are almost, like, we are actually out of time. So thank you very much.